Good evening and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forums Fall Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speakers graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We'll take about 15 or 20 minutes of questions, maybe go to a little after 9 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, we now have a YouTube channel, which we will post this talk to shortly after. You can access the YouTube channel through the icon at the top of the website. I should say fourth, I'll be managing the slides, so any latency or issues with the slides are purely my fault tonight. And then fifth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at www.iidf.org. Now to this evening's speaker and someone who's back for the third time, thrilled to have him. Mark Stille is the author of numerous Osprey titles. I think if you count all of them, over 70 books, focusing on naval history in the Pacific. He recently concluded a nearly 40-year career in the intelligence community, including tours on the faculty of the Naval War College, on the Joint Staff, and on U.S. Navy ships. He received his BA in history from the University of Maryland and also holds an MA from the Naval War College. This evening, Mark is going to discuss his latest book, Pearl Harbor, Japan's Greatest Disaster, which argues that the Japanese attack, which has been conventionally regarded as a brilliant strike, was in fact a tactical disappointment, an operational failure, and a strategic disaster. Not surprisingly, the reviews have been top shelf. John Parshall writes, Mark continues his human work in the field of Pacific War history by bringing his personal experiences as a naval intelligence officer to bear on the most enduring and controversial surprise attack of them all, Pearl Harbor. And Evan Maudsley, certainly a friend of this group and someone who really needs no introduction as well, writes, this is now the definitive history of the Pearl Harbor attack. Comprehensive details are provided, false assumptions corrected, and alternatives suggested. Above all, a persuasive explanation of why the end result was so disastrous for Japan. With that, I'm thrilled to have him, and I will turn it over to Mark.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me back. And like you said, the book comes out today, at least according to Amazon, so it's a good time to talk about it. Is the first slide up there? Because we can go to the second one, Greg, if you're ready.
Yep, 1 second.
So I wrote, next slide, please. So I wrote this book primarily because there are so many myths and misunderstandings about the battle, and we'll just mention some of those up front. And there they are now, and they're a central part of the book, and they're the central part of the discussion tonight. So a lot of these things are staples in all the Pearl Harbor books that you'll read, and all the things on Pearl Harbor you'll see on TV or online. So okay, we're back here with these myths. Can you go back one slide, please, there, Greg? Thank you. This book is meant to be a military account of the battle. There really aren't a lot of, if you will, hardcore military histories of the battle. That's the intent of the book. But even so, I felt compelled to put in a chapter there about the negotiations in the months before the attack. So the question is whether or not these talks were ever going to be fruitful or not. That's discussed in the book. If you know my previous talks or books, you'll know that I'm not a big fan of Yamamoto. And a lot of these accounts will paint him as a man of peace and a great strategist. And of course, that's the basis of the Yamamoto myth, is that this attack on Pearl Harbor was such a great and brilliant idea. So the book talks about that at length. Did the Japanese have any better options than to attack Pearl Harbor? Well, of course they did, and that's also addressed in the book. Like Greg talked about there in that review that Osprey wrote up, a central tenet of the book is this notion that the attack was brilliantly planned. And I think that's totally off base, and that's addressed in the book, and we'll talk about that tonight as well. Were American defenses inadequate? Well, in the event they turned out to be. But was that always going to be the case? They're only inadequate because the Japanese gained total surprise on the real event. Next slide, please. And like I said, this is meant to be a hardcore military account of the battle. So most of the book, or a lot of the book at least, talks about the actual attack itself. So the first attack wave is talked about in great detail, and the second attack wave. It's little known that the first attack wave, in fact, underperformed, at least in Japanese eyes, it underperformed. And the second attack wave was a total fiasco, as we're going to talk about. My favorite myth of the battle, and maybe the most prevalent one, is this notion that the Japanese seriously considered a second attack on December 7th. And had they done so, it would have had strategic impact. And as we'll talk about at length tonight, that is far from the truth. A forgotten aspect of the whole battle was this Japanese submarine offensive. It was a lot more than just midget subs. I think people are somewhat familiar with the midget subs that were active during the attack, but it was a much bigger operation than that. It was a total failure. Another consistent theme in a lot of Pearl Harbor books is that the attack crippled the Pacific Fleet. So we're going to talk about that. Was the attack even necessary strategically? We'll talk about that as well. Next slide, please. And I think any account of the battle has to talk about the notion of whether or not the American commanders there, Admiral Kimmel, General Short, whether they were scapegoated after the attack. And I have very clear views on the matter, which we'll touch on tonight as well. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the road to war. I wrote this chapter in the book because there have been some accounts recently that have introduced the notion that negotiations were bungled and that it wasn't necessarily meant to be that there be hostilities between Japan and America. But I think the record is pretty clear here. And between November 1940 and November 1941, to my mind, it's clear that these negotiations were simply smokescreens as the Japanese prepared for war. And that is because the bottom line to this is that the diplomatic objectives and the interests of the two parties were just too far apart to make negotiations ever viable. As most folks here tonight know, the Japanese invaded China in 1937, and they were bogged down in a quagmire in China by 1941. And later in 1941, they occupied French Indochina. And during the course of the negotiations, the Americans pressed the Japanese to give up their gains in China and give up their recent gains in Indochina. And the Japanese were simply unwilling to do this. It's also apparent to me that across the board, Japanese leaders lacked moral courage. And this goes from the very top across the top leadership of Japan. These men were not clueless. They marched into this war willingly and knowingly that the balance between Japan and America and any potential conflict was heavily against Japan. Nevertheless, they persevered with this path toward war. And this began with the emperor, who could only manage a passive protest when he had a role to play potentially. The politicians who actually had a voice here, because under the Japanese system, the primary members of the cabinet all had to agree on war for Japan to embark on such a course. So they had a voice here that they did not use. They never voiced, most of the politicians were against war, then they never voiced this publicly. And the Navy had a large role to play here potentially as well, because they would be fighting this war against the Americans. And the Navy just deferred to the politicians. They never used their voice to come out against the war. At the same time, these men would, in private, talk about that it may even be better to suffer the humiliation of having to give back their gains in China than to go to war with the Americans, a war that they knew they couldn't win. But that didn't matter in the end. They marched blindly into war without even a real plan for victory. On the other hand, the U.S. was determined to back China, and this was not for moral or economic reasons. It was just a hard geostrategic calculus. The Japanese army was tied down in China, and Roosevelt wanted them to stay tied down in China and not be able to attack the Dutch, the British, or even the Soviets potentially, because he didn't want those parties to be weakened in their struggle against the Nazis. So for all these reasons here, I think that negotiations were never going to be fruitful. Hence, we had this attack on Pearl Harbor that we're going to talk about here. Next slide. And we have to talk about Yamamoto because he is the central figure in the Pearl Harbor saga. It's clear that without him, there would have never been an attack. But a lot of accounts about him paint him as much different than he really was. He was not a man of peace. He was a traditional Japanese nationalist. He supported the imperial system. He supported the war in China. He supported other wars of aggression. He just didn't support a war that he thought that Japan couldn't win. So that's why he warned against fighting the United States. But ironically, here's a man who warned against war with the United States, who actively planned and pressed a plan to broaden the war against the United States. So as we'll see later on, he used bullying tactics to get his way. I would submit that if he was a true man of peace, that he would have offered his resignation as he threatened to do other times, but he never did that. Overall, the Pearl Harbor planning process was an adventure in speculation, as we'll see, as we'll talk about this process later on. But nevertheless, in spite of all this, in spite of the fact that the reasons behind his attack were never fully examined and never laid out, he persevered against almost universal opposition and got the plan approved. Next slide, please. Next slide, Greg. It's another slide about Yamamoto, the real Yamamoto. Part of the planning process is touched on here because as early as March, April 1940, he was talking with his staff about an attack on Pearl Harbor. So Yamamoto, as you probably know, was the commander-in-chief of the Combined Fleet. So his staff is the Combined Fleet staff. And he was talking to them well before the event to look at this possible avenue of action. And he admitted later on that he decided as early as December 1940 to mount the attack on Pearl Harbor. And that's even at the time, the Japanese didn't even have the capability to mount such an attack, but that did not matter to Yamamoto. His objective in doing so nominally was to cripple the American fleet there for 6 months. The Japanese could successfully conquer Southeast Asia and get the resources they needed to circumvent the American economic blockade. But his true reason was much deeper than that. There was a military aspect of the attack and a psychological aspect of the attack. So he lived in America twice, therefore people credit him with this great insight into the American psyche, but nevertheless, he believed that if he could cripple the American fleet, and in his mind, that meant sinking battleships because they were the measure of naval power at the time, that if he sank enough battleships, that would cripple American morale. Obviously, he was way off on this assessment. And in the end, he gained approval for the attack, not because his ideas were so insightful and so brilliant. He was a bully. In the end, he threatened to resign. That's how he got his way. So I would say that the whole Pearl Harbor operation was his unhealthy obsession. Next slide, please. Let's look at the planning process. So in 1941, planning got underway. He had talked about this as we touched on earlier, but in 1941, he approached members of the combined fleet to look at the attack in detail. And this was a guy named Onishi, who was a air power advocate like Yamamoto, and he was known to be a great planner. So he is charged to look at the feasibility of the attack. He pulls in this guy, Commander Genda. Genda's the guy on the top right there, to help him to look at the feasibility of the attack. Genda is a legend in his own time. He's an ex-fighter pilot, and he's known to be, or thought to be, a very innovative planner. So if anybody can figure out how to make this attack work, it would be Genda. And after Yamamoto, Genda becomes the guy most responsible for bringing this plan to fruition. So he gives his thoughts to Onishi. There are 9 principal parts to what he thought had to be done to make the plan work. And most of these, and I think all of them in some form or another, survive until the very last version of the plan. So Onishi gives this draft plan to Yamamoto in about March. At the same time, or right after that, Yamamoto begins to sell the plan to the Naval General Staff. So we have to talk about the friction between the combined fleet and the Naval General Staff. The Naval General Staff, nominally the superior entity to the combined fleet, at least in terms of operational planning. How it should work is they set the strategic context, and then the fleet plans those operations. But that's not the way Yamamoto saw things working. So he has to sell this to the Naval General Staff. In late April, he gets the first air fleet pulled into the planning process. The first air fleet was formed in April, earlier in April, and it's the Japanese carrier fleet. And of course, they'd be the operation, they'd be the entity that would have to carry out the attack. So they are pulled into planning pretty early. Nagumo is the commander of the first air fleet. He's the guy there in the bottom right. He thinks the plan is way too risky and therefore impossible. His chief of staff, Kusaka, also has his serious doubts about the plan. So now you have this very curious situation where the 2 leaders of the unit charged to execute the attack don't believe in the attack. Next slide, please. So there's this ongoing debate between the combined fleet and the Naval General Staff. This goes on for many months. The combined fleet has some justifiable concerns with the plan. Basically, they think it's too risky, and there are a lot of issues that are legitimate that have not been addressed until actually pretty late in the whole process. The fleet had to be refueled to get to Pearl Harbor. The fleet didn't have the proper weapons to attack the American fleet inside Pearl Harbor. And a big one is that surprise was very much in doubt, and the Naval General Staff didn't think it was possible to gain surprise. But without surprise, the attack was not going to work. So, but Yamamoto does get the Naval General Staff to examine the operation in the annual war game, which takes place in September. So this is not really a war game. It's not proper to call it that. It's more like a controlled staff experiment where they could change their variables and examine different courses of action. But they do this during this war game, and they determine that if surprise is gained, that the attack would be feasible. So at the same time, though, Yamamoto is also fighting with the staff of the combined fleet because they didn't think the attack was feasible either. So in October, he holds some tabletop maneuvers, and then after this is done, he asked all the admirals present what their thoughts were about the attack. And of all these gentlemen, and including Nagumo and other principal leaders in the combined fleet, they all argued, except for one, actually, they all argued against the attack. They all thought it was too risky. And they agreed with the Naval General Staff that it wasn't the proper course of action. But Yamamoto had heard enough at that point, and he told them after this debrief that they needed to get on board, because as long as he was in charge of the fleet, they were going to do this attack. So that just left the Naval General Staff to convince. And later in October, Yamamoto brings us to a head, because at this point it's getting kind of late. The Japanese have to take action. If their choices for war, and that's where they were headed, they had to act fairly quickly. So Yamamoto has to know what forces he is going to have available for the attack. He's got to know whether it's approved or not. He brings it to a head. 17, 18 October, there's another conference in Tokyo. Naval General Staff does not agree. So Yamamoto plays his ace card at that point. On 19 October, he sends one of his most trusted staff officers back to lay out the fact that if they don't approve the plan, that Yamamoto and the entire staff of the combined fleet will resign right before the war is set to begin. So obviously that can't happen. So that changes the whole tenor of the debate, and that's how the plan is actually approved. Next slide, please. But there are a lot of salient planning issues here that have to be addressed before the plan was viable. And the Japanese do address these all methodically, and they do address them successfully. But a lot of these weren't addressed until the very end of the planning process. First one we'll talk about is the need for a surprise. Genda addressed this early on. The surprise was utterly crucial to the success of the operation. Surprise really depended upon taking the proper approach route to Pearl Harbor. There were three different options: north, central, and south. As you can see on the slide there, each of these had pros and cons to it. But the route with the greatest prospect of surprise was taking the northern route, even though that meant that they'd have to refuel multiple times. And even though that meant they would have to go through some pretty rough weather there in the Northern Pacific in winter. But that's where there was less traffic. And the Japanese knew from their operatives on the island that the Americans did not fly recce missions, reconnaissance missions to the north of Oahu. So in the end, that's the route that they chose. Nagumo wasn't a fan of that originally, but he was convinced in the end by Kusaka and Genda to take the northern route. And that turned out to be the right decision. And to gain surprise, they determined that the best time to attack would be on a Sunday. They're going to do this in the morning. So Japanese got this one right. Next slide, please. Another issue was refueling. It sounds kind of quaint, but they didn't have the means to get the whole fleet to Pearl Harbor at early in 1941. Yes, they refueled at sea. Yes, they knew how to refuel at sea, but it really wasn't a common part of major fleet operations. So the Japanese had to figure out a way to get this fleet to Pearl Harbor. Kusaka, whose background was in surface warfare, he took on this problem personally, and he got it done. So he got it done by really addressing the issue head on and conducting multiple exercises with the oilers that were allocated to the operation. So just by hard work, they also addressed the refueling issue. Next slide, please. Here are two issues that we're probably more familiar with, and that's getting the right weapons for the fleet to use inside Pearl Harbor. The big one was that they had to have a functional torpedo in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is pretty shallow, at least it was back at that time. So you had to have torpedoes that were functional, because if you wanted to sink battleships, you had to do it with torpedoes. The Type 91, that's their standard torpedo, would not work in about the 40 feet of water in Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese took two steps to change this. First of all, they had to modify the weapon with some wooden fins so it wouldn't dive so deep when it was dropped into the water. This didn't really solve the entire problem. So Genda kept working on this with the leading Imperial Navy torpedo expert, this guy Murata. So he and Genda worked out a profile that by flying at a certain altitude and a certain speed, essentially they were flying very low and very slow, that they could get the torpedoes to function properly after entering the water. But this was not accomplished until very late in the planning process. And in fact, the last of the torpedoes were delivered to the carriers the day before they left for the Pearl Harbor attack. Next slide, please. Another issue was getting horizontal bombers that had the capability to sink battleships. That's important because if you're familiar with how the Americans anchored their battleships in Pearl Harbor, they moored in pairs. So the outboard battleship was vulnerable to a torpedo attack, but the inboard one was not. So you had to have a heavy bomb that could penetrate battleship armor. Japanese didn't have this at the time, but they cleverly took steps to address that in a fairly short period of time. They converted 16-inch battleship shells into these armor-piercing bombs. Then they had to train the aviators to improve their accuracy to have these bombs hit their targets. This was a tough problem, but again, the Japanese drilled incessantly. Genda and Fuchida worked together on this. They broke the attack group down into 5 aircraft groups, which dropped their bombs at the same time with a lead bombardier who was highly trained. So he would drop 5 bombs essentially at the same time. And by doing this, they got the accuracy from about 10% up to about 33% or so before the attack took place. And they also lowered the altitude as far as they could while still keeping that penetrative capability of the bombs to improve accuracy. So they also got this problem mainly right, as we'll see later, but they had some problems with these bombs, as we'll talk about. Next slide, please. We have to touch on the basic event that took place in the months leading up to the attack, which made the attack possible. And if it happened today, we would call this a revolution of military affairs. And that's when the Japanese became the first fleet to concentrate their carriers into a single operational entity. And this took place in April. That was the aforementioned First Air Fleet, which had originally 4 fleet carriers, and later on in August and September, 2 more joined. So 6 fleet carriers with over 400 aircraft. And this was something never done before. It gave them unparalleled striking power, and it made the Pearl Harbor attack possible in its grandest form. The Americans were unaware of this. The Americans were still operating their carriers individually, maybe in groups of 2, but they were unaware the Japanese had massed their carriers. They were aware of this entity called the First Air Fleet, but they didn't really understand what that meant. So here's an underlying reason why they were surprised at Pearl Harbor. Next slide, please. We got to talk about the Americans briefly. There were certainly sufficient forces there to mount a credible defense if they had been used properly. The bulk of the Pacific Fleet, not the entire Pacific Fleet, was in harbor on the day of the attack. They're listed there on the slide. There were 100 ships at Pearl Harbor. Of note, this included 8 of the 9 battleships. The Pacific Fleet only had 3 carriers at this time. One was in a yard in the West Coast, so 2 were active in or around Pearl Harbor. But fortunately for the Americans, neither was in Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack. Americans had a very large force of long-range patrol aircraft. on Hawaii, and also some were deployed to Midway Atoll. The Army was actually responsible for defending the fleet if it was in harbor, and the Army thought that Pearl Harbor was unassailable, or Oahu was an unassailable fortress. They had a large number of aircraft there, to include 150 fighters, about 2/3 of which were operational, large number of anti-aircraft guns, and 6 radar stations. Uh, that could put up a credible defense in almost any scenario. They also set up an information center, which was critical to integrate all these aspects into a viable integrated air defense system. But as we'll see, there were some problems with the information center at this time. Next slide, please. Okay, why were the Americans caught so by surprise on December 7th? It's a very complex issue. It's talked about at length in the book. It does come down, I think, to a lack of imagination on the part of the principal commanders. Kimmel was the commander of the Pacific Fleet. By all accounts, he was a man who dwelled on details, and he lacked imagination in the eyes of many. And that was evident in the run-up to Pearl Harbor, because he never took seriously the notion that Japanese were capable of an air attack on Pearl Harbor. So given that, he ignored warnings from the CNO. At this time, it was Admiral Stark, in October, early November. And then on 27 November, he received the war warning message from the CNO. And it was meant to be an alarm bell for Kimmel, but he didn't take it that way. Why is that? Well, because he was focused on the offensive actions he had planned for the fleet. He saw the fleet as an offensive tool, and not something that was going to be subject to attack in its home port. So in essence, he prioritized readiness for this offensive action he had planned over force protection, which explains, for example, why the 67 long-range patrol aircraft were not used for searches. They were training for this offensive operation he would initiate when hostilities began. General Short was the commander of the Army in Hawaii. He also got his own version of the 27 November war warning message, but he did not interpret this correctly, because after he got it, he doubled down on anti-sabotage measures, not measures that would protect against an air attack. Next slide, please. We got to talk about the intelligence that led up to the battle. And it's not that the Americans were clueless about the prospects for an air raid on Pearl Harbor, because General Martin, who was Short's air commander, and Admiral Bellinger, he was Kimmel's patrol aircraft commander. They and their staff worked on a plan in March that correctly predicted what would happen if the Japanese mounted a large-scale air attack on Pearl Harbor. So some people saw very clearly what might happen. Now, but unfortunately, the Americans were not privy to Japanese intentions. So yes, we were reading Japanese diplomatic traffic, but this is diplomatic traffic. There was no mention of any attack on Pearl Harbor. Nor was there any IMW, any specific Japanese move in the Pacific. Next slide, please. You would think, though, that the Pacific Fleet would be tracking matters much more carefully. They would be tracking the key units in the Imperial Navy, and of course they were. They were tasked to do this. But not having any insight into Japanese intentions, they were wrong on the wrong foot, because they saw no Japanese intent to attack, and they ignored Japanese capabilities. Now, obviously, if the Japanese Navy has 6 fleet carriers, they have the capability of attacking Pearl Harbor or a myriad of targets throughout the Pacific. But this capability was not taken seriously. Why? Because there's some serious groupthink going on here in the staff of the Pacific Fleet. They're also guilty of mirror imaging. Clearly, we would not attack an enemy that was much stronger than ourselves. So the thought was the Japanese would never attack the Americans because we were too strong. And again, keep in mind that this is before we had any insight into the Japanese operational code. So we did not have any insight into actual Japanese intentions. However, we were able to track by a variety of means the movement of a large part of the Japanese fleet into Southeast Asia, because the Japanese were obviously on the march. The Americans understood that, but they thought that the blow would land in Southeast Asia. They were trying to track the carriers in the Japanese fleet, and the Japanese, though, had a simple but effective deception plan underway, and the Americans lost track of the carriers. They assessed them to be in home waters, which was true, but only up to a certain point. They were able to track the movement of submarines into the Marshalls, and in fact, this was the movement of the Japanese submarine force to support the Pearl Harbor attack. So for probably the only occasion in the war, the Japanese won the intelligence war against the US Navy. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to look at the actual attack here. This is the heart of the book. Just to lay out briefly what the first attack wave was going to accomplish. There were a large number of aircraft in this wave. There were 2 waves in all. The focal point of this first wave was against the carriers and the battleships. But we've already seen, though, that there were no carriers in harbor on the morning of the attack. So that created a lot of confusion. So that left the battleships as the primary focus. Since surprise would be in effect, the Japanese planned to land their heavy blows in this first wave attack when they're going to use the torpedo bombers and the horizontal bombers. Other than that, they also took a lot of measures to suppress American air power. In fact, there were more sorties devoted to attacking American air power than there were against naval targets throughout the day, because the Japanese did not want a counter blow against their carrier fleet. Next slide. So what happened after the first wave? What did the first wave accomplish? It was destructive, but actually it wasn't as destructive as the Japanese hoped it would be. The key aircraft in the whole attack are the torpedo aircraft. There were 40 of these. Of these, 36 dropped their torpedo. The Japanese expected to have 27 hits of the 40 aircraft, but the actual number was a lot less than that. This is for a couple of reasons. One was the fact that there was confusion in the opening minutes of the attack, because those 16 torpedo bombers that were allocated against the carriers, when they showed up and there were no carriers there, they didn't have a real backup plan. And this is in spite of the fact that early in the morning of 7 December, the Japanese received word, again from their operatives on Oahu, that on the 6th there were no carriers in port. But they didn't see fit to change their plans. They simply hoped that the carriers would show up over the weekend. So, and then those torpedo aircraft that did attack over-concentrated on 2 of the most obvious and easy to reach battleships on Battleship Row. So over-concentration and confusion limited the effectiveness of the torpedo bombers. But they did gain 12 hits on the 2 most reachable battleships, those being Oklahoma and West Virginia. And overall, they hit 7 ships with torpedoes. They should have done a lot better than that, but they didn't. Level bombers were partially successful. 50 aircraft were allocated, 49 actually launched. 10 hits were scored of the 49. That's about 20% accuracy. But critically of these, though, 6 of the bombs failed to function. They were duds, or they were only partial detonations. So they should have had better results as well from the level bombers. But we all know, though, if you know anything about the attack, you do know about the fatal blow to battleship Arizona. This was from one of these level bombers. So one of these bombs hit Arizona, ignited the forward magazine, destroyed the forward part of the ship utterly, and resulted in a large number of the crewmen being killed. So from that standpoint, that's about as successful the Japanese hoped that they would be with the horizontal bombers, but again, it should have been better. And the first wave attacks by the other aircraft focused on American air power went very well, but that's because these airfields were unprotected by anti-aircraft fire, and the aircraft were lined up in rows, so pretty easy targets. And of note, Japanese losses in the first wave were very light. However, that was changing. Even during the course of the first wave, American anti-aircraft fire became more and more intense. And this was seen by the fact that the last group of torpedo bombers to attack, and these are the aircraft flying low and slow, they're very vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. The last 5 torpedo bombers were all shot down. So had there even been a few minutes warning, the torpedo bombers would not have been as successful. Next slide, please. Second attack wave, you see there, the centerpiece of the attack were these 81 dive bombers, which were allocated against naval targets inside the harbor. These are the elite dive bomber pilots of the Imperial Navy, so a lot was expected of them. Their primary target was supposed to be the carriers. Even if they were sunk, they were supposed to go after the hulks and bomb them into shambles so they couldn't be salvaged. Next slide, please. So what happened after the second wave? The second wave was an utter fiasco. If you look at the results of this very carefully, you'll see that there's no other word for it. 78 dive bombers actually attacked. There were no carriers there, so they couldn't attack carriers. But they were told not to attack battleships because with the fairly small bombs that they carried, you're not going to penetrate battleship armor with these small bombs. So why attack battleships? Their primary target should have been cruisers, but only 11 of the 78 pilots went after cruisers. Most of these pilots ignored their pre-attack orders and they went after battleships. And 23 attacked targets that weren't even on their priority target list. So the attack was not well executed at all. And the results were pretty meager. If you can go back one slide there, because that's a key point. The Japanese claimed 49 hits. This is a total fabrication. The actual number was only 16. So 16 of 78 dive bombers scored a hit. There are a lot of reasons for that that we can talk about later if we have time. But they hit, for the most part, they hit targets not even on the target list. Next slide. So another part of the operation, which is literally forgotten, is the major part played by combined fleet submarines. Every modern submarine in the combined fleet was allocated to the attack, and a lot was expected of them because when the Americans flushed their fleet out of Pearl Harbor, these submarines were deployed all around the Hawaiian Islands, so it was thought that they'd have no problem picking off the American fleet as it left harbor. There was also this exotic part of the submarine plan to get 5 midget submarines into the harbor during the height of the attack. As it turns out, though, the entire submarine offensive was a total failure. Of these, there were of the 30 submarines, 25 of them were deployed in Hawaiian waters. then they should have been able to attack one of the numerous merchant ships in the area and the numerous naval ships coming and going from Pearl Harbor. Very few of these submarines even spotted the target, much less made an attack. Total take from the operation in the days that followed, only 5 merchant ships, and they lost 1 sub in the process. We got to talk about the mini subs though very briefly, because that was that could have blown up badly in the face of the Japanese, because these submarines went in hours before the attack started. And the aviators were very fearful that they'd be discovered early and they would compromise the surprise of the entire operation. That's a very legitimate concern, and that's what could have happened, because 1 sub was discovered at 3:42 and it was sunk at 6:51. This is over an hour before the attack began. So had the Americans been more on the ball, they could have reacted much quicker than they did. Only one of the 5 midget subs was able to even enter the harbor. It fired 2 torpedoes, missed, and it was sunk. Maybe some people are familiar with the TV show that came out recently, well, not that recently, but came out that introduced the notion that one of these submarines was able to get into the harbor and launch a torpedo at Battleship Row. And the entire basis for this was a blurry photograph that they said showed a midget sub in the middle of the harbor. In fact, all 5, the wrecks and the torpedoes carried by all 5 midget subs have been accounted for. So this story of the midget sub inside the harbor launching an attack on Battleship Row is a total fabrication. Next slide. So the losses were quite heavy for the Americans, but as we'll talk about, these were not crippling losses. The Americans were totally surprised. A lot of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. A lot of personnel losses were incurred. A lot of these, almost half, were from the sinking of Arizona alone. But of the 100 ships in Pearl Harbor, only 18 were sunk or damaged. Japanese focused their attack on the battleships. There were 8 present, so 4 of these were sunk. 1 was beached, and 3 others were lightly damaged. So if this was going to be a battleship war from here on out, this would be crippling losses. But after Pearl Harbor, it was obvious that the Pacific War was not going to be a battleship war. It's going to be a carrier war. So these are far from crippling losses. Japanese losses have been painted usually as very light and insignificant. Well, this is not the case. They did lose 29 aircraft, but another 17 were either ditched on the way back, or once they got back, they were so heavily damaged they were thrown overboard. So they lost almost 50 aircraft during the attack, and a large number were damaged. So had there been any notion to launch a second attack, this would have mattered. Next slide, please. And speaking of the second attack, let's talk about that. This is a 3-headed myth that has gained momentum over the years. It's the work of one man, and that's Fuchida. Fuchida was one of the principal planners along with Genda, and he was the attack leader. He actually flew one of the aircraft in the first wave. So he is the creator of this second attack myth. So it's a 3-headed myth. One was that the Japanese seriously debated whether or not to mount a second attack on the late morning of 7 December. And then had they done so, they would have concentrated on the naval infrastructure there, the Navy Yard and the fuel tanks. And had they done that, they would have created such damage that it would have been a strategically significant setback for the Pacific Fleet that might have even been forced to depart from Pearl Harbor and operate from the West Coast. And all of these is simply and utterly false, as we'll talk about here. So right after the war, when Fuchida was asked about this, he didn't mention any. He was asked, well, why didn't you guys launch a second attack? And he didn't mention that there was a debate about this, because there was no debate. Kusaka was on the bridge the entire time. and he testified that there was never any discussion of a second attack. So this notion that a second attack was discussed in a very heated way, this was a fabrication of Fuchida in 1963 when he was giving an interview to my college professor, Gordon Prang. So this is the start of the second attack myth. But in actuality, there was no prospect of a second attack ever taking place because Nagumo had told Genda in the months before that he was not going to countenance a second attack. He kept saying to Genda, one attack only, one attack. And there were operational reasons why it wouldn't have been possible. There just wasn't enough time to do it on 7 December. If you break down a timeline, the last of the aircraft don't get back to the carriers until just before 1300, and then you have to create a plan because there was no plan to attack a second time. You have to create a plan, you have to rearm the aircraft, refuel the aircraft, and brief the pilots in a very short period of time. But let's say that they were able to do this in a couple of hours. Unlikely, but let's pretend that that was possible. So they launch at 1500. Well, it's a 3-hour flight back and forth to Pearl Harbor from where the striking force was, which would have meant that the aircraft would have been recovered after dark. And this was, these aviators were good, but they were not trained for night operations. So Nagumo would never have mounted a night attack. And let's talk about the notion that they missed a great opportunity by not attacking the infrastructure in Pearl Harbor. Well, that was there when they asked Fuchida, well, why didn't you attack the fuel tanks? He said, well, no one ever thought about that because the Japanese didn't think like that. They were trained in this Mahanian way that you attack the enemy's fleet. You don't attack a naval base. That's not how you gain sea control. So even though Fuchida wrote about this in 1963 and afterward in the series of interviews and writings that he made, that he thought about, well, I think what we should do is attack the naval infrastructure. It's very unlikely the Japanese, as they were scrambling to create this plan, that they would have forsaken their training and just gone off and attacked infrastructure. So that wasn't going to happen. But let's suppose that Nagumo had an epiphany. He wanted to launch the second attack, and he agreed with the Fuchida from 1963. He would have advocated that they attack naval infrastructure. They didn't have the forces available to knock out a huge area target like the naval yard. The naval yard was almost 500 acres. There were 54 different oil tanks, all revetted separately in the naval base area. So the number of aircraft available would have been rather small in the afternoon. We're talking here about 60 dive bombers, maybe 60 attack planes, which carried a total of 180 bombs. So with 180 bombs, you're going to knock out a large area target like the naval yard and destroy any number, a large enough number to make a difference of these oil tanks? No, that was extremely unlikely. And then to leap from that to say that the Pacific Fleet would have been crippled by the destruction of its infrastructure just fails to consider, first of all, what was possible by the Japanese, and also fails to consider the powers of the Americans to regenerate the base, and also use all the tenders they had available already at Pearl Harbor, the repair ships, the submarine tenders, destroyer tenders, and other ships to keep the fleet operating. So there's no basis at all to support the notion that the Japanese missed a big opportunity at Pearl Harbor. Next slide. Let's look at the attack briefly from a tactical and an operational and strategic level. That's also a big part of the book because this attack simply wasn't worth the squeeze for the Japanese. It wasn't well planned in all regards. Some aspects were well planned, some were not. For example, the midget sub-involvement. and there were a couple of pre-dawn recce flights that were detected on radar. These were unnecessary, and they did jeopardize the surprise of the entire operation. We talked about the underachievement by the torpedo bombers and by the horizontal bombers. This was due to lack of planning. These 16 torpedo bombers that came in to attack carriers that weren't there. They therefore attacked ships of no particular value, or they tried to attack Battleship Row, creating more confusion in the process. And throughout the day, Japanese pilots had a very bad target recognition skills in evidence. The second wave dive bombers, that was just an atrocious display. And why was that? It's because three reasons: bad weather, because there was overcast clouds above the harbor by the second wave attack, and the Japanese didn't plan for the potential of bad weather. But they should have known that there was a great potential that there would be just such an overcast on a typical day in December. Also, there's a lot of smoke from the second attack, or from the first attack, which impeded the second attack. Japanese should have planned on that. And there's a lot of anti-aircraft fire. So that was why the second wave dive bomber attack did so poorly. Another aspect that isn't usually examined is this fighter doctrine that the Japanese used. They used their fighters, obviously, to gain air supremacy over Oahu, which they didn't have to use in that regard, because there are no American aircraft airborne during the first part of the first wave. So they were then used to attack various airfields around the island. And that meant that they left their bombers unprotected and attacked airfields. And did that matter so much during the actual event? No, not really, even though there were some US fighters that were active later in the morning that did attack unprotected bombers, but it didn't matter during the actual event. But had the Americans got some fighters airborne before the attack, it would have mattered a lot. Next slide, please. Next slide, Greg. That's going to talk about.
Hang on one second, Mark.
Sure.
Here we go.
It's going to talk about whether the attack was effective operationally. We talked about there's certainly some significant damage to the Pacific Fleet, but it wasn't crippling damage. We talked about these 18 ships. Only 3 of these did not return to service. These old battleships were not frontline units. That was shown to be the case for the next 6 months of the war. In fact, I would contend that the unit that the Japanese damaged on 7 December, the one of most value, was the modern light cruiser Helena, which returned to action in time for the Guadalcanal campaign. But the other ships that were damaged or sunk were not critical units. The Pacific Fleet recovered quite quickly. On 1 February, it began a series of offensive actions against Japanese holdings in the Central Pacific. And in May, they stopped the Japanese in the Coral Sea. And in June, the Pacific Fleet sank 4 of the 6 carriers, which carried out the Pearl Harbor attack. So the attack did not buy much for the Japanese operationally. Next slide, please. Strategically, the attack backfired on the Japanese. The attack was actually not necessary. If the nominal reason for the attack was to cripple the Pacific Fleet for 6 months so that the Japanese could conquer their objectives in Southeast Asia, that was not necessary, because the Americans did not have the logistic capability to exert power into the Western Pacific. The Pacific Fleet was not capable of doing that. The attack was not going to achieve Yamamoto's aims of crippling the fleet or smashing American morale. And for him to think that it would just shows his lack of skills as a strategist. In fact, that if you look at the Japanese notion for victory, which was rather ill-defined. It came down to a negotiated peace after some protracted period of war, that the Americans would get tired of bashing their head against the wall of Japanese conquest and talk about a peace. Well, that's unlikely if the Americans have been roused to avenge this unprovoked and treacherous attack on Pearl Harbor. So the attack undermined the actual prospects of a negotiated peace that the Japanese so earnestly wanted to have happen. Otherwise, they had no viable plan for victory. Next slide. All right, last couple of slides, we're going to talk about the notion of Kimmel and Short as scapegoats for the attack. Obviously, something went very wrong on 7 December in the eyes of the Americans. That was undeniable. Aircraft were caught on the ground. Ships were caught unprepared. It was a debacle. Therefore, both Kimmel and Short were relieved on 17 December. So the first investigation of the attack began right after the attack concluded. There were 10 of these conducted from 1941 to 1995. The Americans tried to understand what happened. The first attack was maybe the most consequential at all. It was the Roberts Commission, which found that Kimmel and Short were culpable of misjudgment. It absolved Washington of responsibility for the most part, but it went as far as to accuse Kimmel and Short of dereliction of duty, which perhaps was a step too far. In 1995, the last investigation, the Dorn report, looked at this again, and they determined that responsibility should be more broadly shared, but they still held Kimmel and Short responsible for misjudgments, but there was no talk of dereliction of duty. But clearly, throughout these 10 investigations, Kimmel and Short were found wanting. However, there's enough fault to go around for all concerned. Washington was culpable in a number of ways, and it's not because they had intelligence that they didn't share. It's true that they didn't share all intelligence with Kimmel and Short, but there was no intelligence that was actionable that talked about a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Washington was guilty of not sending a focused 27 November message that warned of hostilities. To my mind, it was certainly adequate warning of war, but if Washington was convinced that hostilities were imminent, they should have been more adamant about that in their message. And most of all, they should have been exercising proper oversight of their commanders after this message, and they failed to do that. Next slide. But there's a lot that we can lay at Kimmel's door, and even more that we can hold Short responsible for. Kimmel's fault was massive here, I think, and undeniably so. His lack of imagination came into play. He totally failed to conceive even the possibility of an air attack on Pearl Harbor and took no steps to address that threat. On the day of the attack, how many U.S. aircraft were active conducting search operations in and around Oahu? The answer is 0. Therefore, there was a 0% chance that they were going to find the Japanese carrier strike force before the attack. Kimmel ordered no increased readiness for the fleet. Most of the fleet was caught in harbor on 7 December, and it could have been a real disaster had one of the carriers been in port on that Sunday as it was supposed to be. So his lack of planning would have placed 8 of the 9 battleships and 1 of the 2 operational carriers in port at the same time. And there were several indications of Japanese operations around Oahu on the morning of 7 December, but the command and control system that Kimmel put in place was unable to respond. Short's faults were also considerable. Again, he did not see the possibility of an air attack on Oahu. He thought he was ready to deal with that if, by some unlikely reason, it did occur. In fact, when he got the 27 November message, excuse me, the war warning message, he actually reduced his readiness to repel an air attack because he prepared for sabotage attacks. Therefore, there wasn't a single fighter that was fully fueled, armed, and ready to go on the morning of 7 December. And those that were present were lined up in rows. No aircraft guns were manned. And the information center, which you had to have to identify a threat and take appropriate measures, was dysfunctional. So in my mind, it's clear that Kimmel and Short bear massive culpability for the failure of the Americans to be ready for the attack. All right, that's the last slide. And now we have some time if there are any questions.
Great job, Mark. Thanks as always. There are already several questions in the queue and in the raised hands as well. So just start. Gary asks, Yama is always dramatized in movies, saying sadly, waking a sleeping giant. Was this a true sad saying or just mythology?
There's, I mean, it's something he should have said. I mean, because it fits his situation so well. But I have been unable to find that quote attributed to him.
Mm. Charles, did the Japanese ever think there might be radar at Pearl Harbor?
That's a good question. I don't think they really understood radar in any real sense at this point in the war, so I never saw any indication that they planned on having to deal with radar and how it might give the Americans an early warning.
Tom asks, can you explain or clarify a little more the Japanese intelligence failure and being unaware the carriers were out of port?
Well, it wasn't intelligence failure because the Japanese were fully aware of the movement of the fleet. So they had an operative who was given free run of the island. He kept very detailed records of fleet movements, and the Japanese knew exactly when the carriers and other major ships came and went. They knew that there were only two carriers in the Pacific Fleet at this point, and they reported that on the 6th that they weren't present. So it was far from an intelligence failure. In fact, like I said, this was the one time in the war that Japanese intelligence did a very good job.
Mm. Mike asks, who was the one person who sided with Yamamoto at the tabletop maneuvers in October, and were they persuaded or already in his corner? Love your book on Leyte Gulf.
Leyte Gulf, that's my favorite battle. Thank you for your kind comments there. But the other guy that sided with Yamamoto was Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi was a mini Yamamoto in many ways, also an attaché in America, an air power advocate. He was kind of a hothead, though. He was the commander of the 2nd Carrier Division. So he was also present at Midway. He committed suicide at Midway. So he was the one principal admiral that supported Yamamoto in this October conference.
Gary writes, I really enjoyed your very well thought out presentation. I look forward to reading your book. What do you think of the proposition that the critical development in the Pacific War was the passage of the Two Ocean Naval Bill a year and a half before Pearl Harbor?
That's a good point, and it was on one of the slides. I didn't really go through it, but the Japanese were clearly aware of the scope of the planned American buildup, and there was a certain necessity to act now or never as far as the Japanese Navy was concerned. So once the American naval buildup was complete in 1944, they saw the Imperial fleet being about 30% of the strength of the U.S. Navy. So yes, that was a background factor that drove them to action in 1941.
Joseph just says, really enjoyed your lecture. Mark writes, one carrier was ferrying aircraft to Wake. Where was the other one?
Well, Enterprise was the one that should have been back in Pearl Harbor on the morning of 7 December. Now, she had just come back she was ferrying aircraft. I guess she had just taken the squadron of Wildcats to Wake Atoll. And the other one, Lexington, was coming back, was involved in transferring dive bombers to Midway.
Graham asks, what basis for the Army fear of sabotage?
Well, a lot of reasons, but there's a huge Japanese ethnic population on the island, uh, and good old-fashioned racism was at play here. Uh, I mean, that was again, they didn't see an overwhelming concern for a Japanese air attack. Therefore, the primary concern must have been internal.
Rose asks, if the carriers were destroyed, would that have made a strategic difference in the outcome of the war?
Well, in the outcome of the war, certainly not. That slide there I didn't go into depth on, but the scale of the American construction program after Pearl Harbor was so massive that, uh, as far as the war was concerned, no, it would have made no difference. And now, had the two carriers of the Pacific Fleet both been caught in Pearl Harbor, which was unlikely, but maybe the one could have been, would that have made a difference in the next few months? Well, I don't think so, because in essence, the Americans operated without one carrier anyhow in the first few months of the war, because Saratoga was torpedoed in January 1942. So, but they did pull in Hornet from the Atlantic Fleet. They later brought in Wasp. So the loss of one carrier at Pearl Harbor wouldn't have been a dramatic difference for the next few months of operations.
Okay, we'll take two more in the queue and then two more raised hands. Mark asks, what do you think of the notion that the Japanese did us a favor by sinking our battleships, BBs, at Pearl Harbor instead of in a large battle at the Central Pacific? War Plan Orange, question mark.
Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't really touch upon that a whole lot, but that was the Japanese alternative to not attacking Pearl Harbor, was this all-out uh, all-out battle strategy, as the Japanese called it, for this climactic fleet clash somewhere in the area of the Marshalls, as the Japanese saw it happening in 1941. So that's when these old battleships would have been sunk, perhaps at sea, where they couldn't have been salvaged. The crew losses would have been even worse than they were at Pearl Harbor. So that's a valid point. Would the Japanese Navy have been better off if they would have fought their long planned for uh, battle against the U.S. Navy in the Central Pacific instead of Pearl Harbor? I think the answer is yes.
Okay, Joe, Joyce, I'm going to unmute your line if you want to ask your question. Joe? Okay, Mamie, go to.
Sorry, I muted myself. Sorry. Okay, I really appreciate the presentation, but the one thing I would basically disagree with you on is Yamamoto. In this particular battle, this is the highlight of his military career, and he's not responsible for the strategy of Japan. That's way above him. They should have relieved him. You know, he told them what he wanted to do, and they went along with it. So I don't know how you could hold him at fault for that. This is probably one of the greatest raids in history. This is a complete success as far as a raid goes. So, you know, after this, I fully agree with you. He goes downhill from here. He probably has victory disease. But this is his greatest success. It's the only thing he really has on his plate, you know, and I'm surprised that you're belittling it. And actually, in your talk, you're not belittling it all the time. There's a number of things they do right, you know. So I'm just appreciate your comments on that. Thank you.
Well, I think you will miss the point of the book if you read it, and miss the point of the talk tonight. The raid was not a complete success. The raid underperformed in a number of ways and only brought them pain in the end. It was a strategic nightmare for the Japanese. So yes, you're right, though. This is what the legend of Yamamoto as the great strategist hangs its hat on. It is this so-called success of Pearl Harbor, but it was far from a success, as I hope to have made clear in the course of this discussion.
Okay, just one quickly though. For 5 months, it was a success. Okay, they ruled the Pacific. I mean, they took more territory than the Germans did, even if it was water. You know, so to say that, you know, I agree with you. In the end, it's going to cost the Japanese, but that's not his job. This is way above his pay grade. And as a naval commander, Pearl Harbor is brilliant as far as I'm concerned.
Well, again, you've missed the whole point of the talk if you believe that. He in essence hijacked Japanese national strategy by insisting upon this attack on Pearl Harbor. He made it his mission to introduce a broadened war against the Americans into Japanese strategy early in the war, and it didn't pay off. And it didn't matter if the Japanese made temporary gains in the Pacific, because within a few months of the opening of the war, the Japanese expansion was stopped in the Pacific by a fleet that should have been crippled in Pearl Harbor, but it wasn't. So Pearl Harbor bought the Japanese virtually nothing.
Okay, we'll go to Joseph Strange if you want to unmute your line and ask your question. Joseph? Okay, RMM, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question. Hello? Okay. I think we. Hello, RMM? We can, yeah, barely.
Okay, one quick question. Where were the attack submarines for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and what were they doing?
Most of the American subs, modern subs at this point, there were only 4 in Pearl Harbor. So 29 were attached to the Asiatic fleet, and they were tasked to defend the Philippines against an expected Japanese invasion. And as you know, they were largely, well, not largely, they were unsuccessful in that role. And there were some other submarines on the West Coast in overhaul and whatnot, but there were only a handful of submarines in Pearl Harbor at the time.
Okay, I think that's it for all the questions we have. Once again, thank you to Mark for a great talk. The book is Pearl Harbor, Japan's Greatest Disaster. Please join us this Saturday when historian Lawrence Drake will talk about his book, Pilots and Painted Ladies, which offers sort of a personal introspection into aircraft's downtime in which they painted artwork and identifying names onto the nose of their aircraft. And the historian is also a personal painter as well and has a connection there. So thank you very much for joining us. Mark, thanks again for another great talk. We hope to have you back on the next lecture. And until then, everyone have a good evening tonight.
Thanks, Greg. Good night.